I'm Aaron Lyon, the director of the University of Washington Smart Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final talk in our 2020 speaker series. These talks began in person and have since, of course, gone virtual, as so many other things in our world today. We will be continuing the speaker series next year, and time will tell whether that happens virtually or in person. But I think we've been able to demonstrate, at least to ourselves, over the last few speakers, that we can carry it out virtually, I think, pretty effectively. So regardless, it will be continuing, and please watch your email and social media for information about additional speakers. Let's see, I'm gonna move us forward here and provide just a little bit of an overview about the Smart Center under which the speaker series is carried out. It's made possible largely through a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the U.S. Department of Education's major research funding arm, awarded to our colleague, the principal investigator on our postdoctoral training grant, Eric Bruns. So just a little quick background. I want to talk about kind of what brings us together at the Smart Center and provide a little context for, I think, a lot of what our speaker will be talking about today. We're really motivated at the Smart Center by two major gaps. One, access and utilization of services, as well as enhancing service quality, knowing that these two are interconnected and complementary. It doesn't matter how accessible mental behavioral health services are if they're not high quality. And similarly, the highest quality intervention or prevention program isn't going to have any sort of public health impact and isn't going to have any sort of impact on students and families unless it is accessible. And each of these are really underpinned by a focus on equitable service access and equitable access to high quality services that we're focused on in the Smart Center. Our overall mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social emotional behavioral needs of all students through research, technical assistance, and support to policymaking. At the bottom here, you can see a photo of a lot of members of the Smart Center when physical distancing was not part of our lives, and this is something that we hope to return to as soon as humanly possible. I want to talk just for a moment about the Smart Center and our focus and our use of sort of a multi-tiered system of support framework. We use this to consider pretty much all of our projects and fit them into one tier or another. For those unfamiliar with MTSS, it's really a way of organizing services, social, emotional, behavioral, and academic services. We focus more of course, on social, emotional, and behavioral services at the Smart Center, but just sort of a set of example projects at increasing levels as one moves up the tier of intensity of these services, ranging from some tier 1 programs focused on enhancing student-teacher relationships, addressing disproportionality and discipline, organizational assessment for kind of universal or tier 1 program readiness, building leadership supports all at tier 1. Tier 2, we have some interventions that we've been developing and are helping to implement in many different school contexts surrounding brief assessment and triage strategies, among others. And then all the way up to tier 3, really indicated interventions for students, such as students who have trauma responses or could even be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as work going on focused on students with autism spectrum disorders, sometimes in self-contained classrooms. Just a few more notes about the Smart Center. If you'd like to learn more about us, we have a website that was relatively recently updated, and there's the URL down at the bottom. We also try to be as active as possible on Twitter and other social media. One additional note is that if you would like to join our mailing list, this is managed by the school mental health supplement of our regional mental health technology transfer center, which is housed, the school mental health supplement is housed within the Smart Center. And we have a school mental health mailing list that you can feel free to sign up for at that URL below. You can also link to this from our main Smart Center website. So now, before I jump into this, I just want to give some quick housekeeping. I believe that we have a chat box, Q&A. Chat will be turned off, but if you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature. We're going to try our best to answer them as they come in, but we'll also try to address most at the end of the presentation. And I think Superintendent Reykdal will be moving into Q&A for a substantial portion of this session, which I think will be a fantastic opportunity to discuss. This presentation will be recorded and posted on the Smart Center website at a later date. And I believe, without further ado then, it's really my pleasure to introduce State Superintendent Chris Reykdal, former high school teacher who's been our state superintendent since early 2017. Under Superintendent Reykdal, OSPI, the Office of Superintendent for Public Instruction, has been focused a lot on the whole child, including social, emotional, behavioral health, in addition to academics. Other things that have been sort of major focuses have been multi-tiered systems of support, which I was already talking about, and aligns very well with our mission here at the Smart Center, which is one of the many reasons we're very happy to have him here today. Social emotional learning has also been a focus, as well as equity in student discipline, which is something that we care deeply about at the Smart Center. And more than that, Superintendent Reykdal is an outspoken advocate for our state and our children on Twitter, which many of us greatly appreciate. And I think that with that, unless there are any housekeeping items that I've forgotten, and if so, I think one of our colleagues in the Smart Center will probably jump in and say so, I would like to turn it over to State Superintendent Chris Reykdal. Thanks.
Well, very good. It's good to see you all sort of virtually, one at a time on the screen. I'm Chris Reykdal, State Superintendent, and I am coming to you all from our offices here in Olympia. We're normally an organization of about 400 between us, the Professional Educator Standards Board, and the State Board of Education. We actually share a common facility. We probably have maybe a dozen people in our facility now. Like so many, we've identified essential services, and ironically, as you all now know, IT is one of those essential services. With all of the Zoom and connection that's happening remotely and at a distance, this is a remarkable time for all of us to sort of get better at that skill. But that said, I don't want this to be our future. I think there's a lot of isolation going on right now for our students. And today I just want to talk a little bit about our journey and how this has evolved, at least through the eyes of the state superintendent. The perspective of a parent is with me. I have two teenagers, one middle school, one high school. The wife of a state employee, but who has also spent 20 plus years in mostly guidance counseling, career counseling work, but her own share of mental health counseling as a part of that in schools. So I bring a lot of lenses to the work today, and mostly I just want to share the experience that we observe collectively across the state at this moment and kind of what's ahead of us. Caveats, of course. Your experience is very different based on your lived experience. Our students are seeing this in really different ways and actually more diverse than I think most people give them credit for. It is not universal that students are longing for school and wanting to come back. There's a lot of them who report to me that this is sort of the way they wish they could live their lives. Wake up at noon, eat by 3, hang out with the family in the evening, do some studying late, get on Fortnite by midnight, go to bed by 2 or 3 in the morning. This is like the new teenage culture across America. And I'm not sure it's the right thing to do for sleep cycles, but it's interesting how diverse these perspectives are. Geography is playing a very big role in how people see this epidemic and subsequently the school closure order and how they're experiencing that and how they are navigating that. Population density seems to be the driving factor in the epidemiology more than anything else. And so you're seeing really disparate sort of responses to all of this around the state. But let's talk a little bit first about our journey and kind of how we got here and Some of this is epidemiology, and some of this is how the governor's office and our office reacted and kind of where we've landed. And then I definitely want to move to what we think the fall looks like. And the thread through all this, of course, is the experience of students and families, and how much risk there is in a moment of trauma like this, sort of collective trauma around the state, to those most vulnerable. But again, occasionally you'll hear me make a nod to an experience for some students that is better for them, interestingly. And the return to school is the bigger anxiety. And I think in the work that most of you do, and most of you have centered your careers around or are aiming to do that, you know how complex we are as people, and it is not monolithic in terms of the experience of anything, particularly this moment. So that said, I take you back to March very quickly. This rolled out very, very fast. As I've said to superintendents around the state, the way we come out of this will be much more differential than the way we come into this. At the front end of a crisis like this, there's little known about the disease, there's little known about its spread, there's a presumption, as it should be at the time, of highest potential risk, and therefore your decision making tends to be more centralized, and you definitely err on the side of, you know, maximum public health. So big, broad closures. We started off with sort of intermittent closures in our districts. And that's the first jumping off point I want to make specifically for you all and the work that you do, because it should not be lost on people that before the governor closed Snow King and Pierce County and ultimately the whole state, we began to see attendance rates falling pretty precipitously in Northeast King County and Southeast Snohomish County. The news around the Life Care Center was certainly headlines around the state. But what was interesting is even as we sort of radiated away from that early epicenter, we saw absentee rates starting to creep up. My point there is before there were known cases, before there was documentation, and before there was any talk of closures, families were beginning to make a decision about attending school based on their own assessment of risk, health risk and worry. And that shouldn't be discounted, because it tells you, tells me that in a world where we are so interconnected digitally, the news cycles are so fast and so tight, the fact that we can localize the news, so in other words, take the global risk and the global trauma of a pandemic and make it so local so fast, that had impact immediately. And people began to internalize their health risks and made decisions even before policymakers did. That began to inform us so that we could say to the governor, hey, you may be trying to be strategic here and temporarily closing down a facility and really cleaning it and bringing them back. But the people of the state of Washington, parents and kids in particular, they're voting with their feet based on their perception of reality. And it doesn't matter whether you want to close or not, eventually they'll close themselves. By lack of participation, they will simply make schools very difficult to function. That's complicated, right? Because we have this paramount duty to serve our students. It's the #1 priority of our state. It's 53% of our state budget. I often joke with my fellow statewide elected officials, the other 8, I say, hey, what's the deal here? You have 47% of the budget between the 8 of you, and I have 53%. And maybe you need to help us out here a little bit, which they mostly do, which is pretty cool. But it's interesting how it has played out here. Ultimately, the governor closed down schools. Snohomish King and Pierce County was the early logic of the epicenter, and very quickly it became obvious that the whole state would go, because eventually the epidemiology would catch up with every county, certainly dense regions, and other states were beginning to make the decision. Interestingly, I observed for you that the original closure order, which seems like it was years ago and it was only 8 weeks ago or so, was originally to be about a 5-week closure, maybe a 6-week closure. Even then we thought, well, this thing has a certain spike to it and we'll get the caseload down. We'll make sure we don't put too much stress on the acute care systems. We'll do a lot of educating around hygiene, and we'll sort of return people here in late April. That was the plan in most states. Probably by the first week of April, it became obvious to everybody, if not late March, that this had gotten really big from a epidemiology standpoint, from a risk standpoint, from the lack of testing, the lack of tracing, the lack of response. And it was pretty obvious that it was going to be a case where almost all the states were going to close down. The governor did that in our state. Subsequently, 42 other states have closed down. So here's where we are globally, if you follow any of the metrics. 1.6 billion kids around the planet are now out of traditional school. Very few countries have returned en masse, but a couple of them are now starting to ease back a little bit. 53 million US kids are out of school in a traditional sense. All states are closed right now, although a few of them are just starting to think about inching back. Most have decided, 42 of them, to close for the rest of the school year and await direction from their respective governors about the summer. So what did I observe in student behavior and parent behavior through all of this? If my inbox could have been appropriately cataloged, hey, wait, maybe this is a research project for somebody. I think you would have seen some really interesting waves that occurred. The initial wave and response from students and parents was thank you. High risk, high anxiety, lots of unknowns about the virus, and a graciousness about, yes, it is time to close. Let's err on the side of caution. And students cheered in the beginning because they thought they were coming back to school after a few weeks. And it was like this really awesome, second winter break or an extended spring break. And they thought, wow, this is really cool. They caught up on sleep. The system had this temporary notion to it. We kept saying to them, like, take the time to build a long-term plan through the rest of the school year in case we have to close down for the rest of the year. Obviously, we were seeing the epi and we were working with the governor's office and Department of Health, and it was becoming more obvious, the risk. But in the beginning, all we could really guide to was this notion that, at the time of the closure, we plan to be back, but you also need to be planning for the long term. So districts, I thought, took that pretty seriously, really disparate impacts around the state, very different responses. Some communities immediately turned on distance learning. They had the technology, they had the vision, they had the professional development in place. And chances are they were a relatively property, at least middle, if not high property value community who had tech levies. So they had connectivity options for their kids. Others waited a very long time. Either they believed we were coming back or they needed a long time to deploy. So the wave from families and students in the beginning was like, hey, this is awesome. This is euphoric. This is the right thing to do. We're nervous about the health, but this is the right call. And people were really comfortable with that. Then the reality of learning kicked in and the experience of kids being at home trying to navigate complex systems, often in isolation of support systems that were there for them. And interestingly, since so many of you deal and work with multi-tiered systems of support, and some of you, I think a lot of the professionals tend to focus on tier 2, tier 3 stuff. I think oftentimes, at least in large systems like mine with 100,000 employees and $1 billion a month spent, we make a lot of assumptions about kids in tier 1, a lot of false assumptions. And I would observe that from my teenagers, they were relatively high functioning kids in school. And it turns out it was the routine of getting up, getting calories, getting to school, having structured time, definitely interacting with their friends, post-bell activities, whether it's athletics or clubs, getting home. We had a structure around activities in the evening. It was an order to them. And kids, many students, I think, tend to thrive in that order. And it's not inappropriate, of course, it's helpful, but it can mask a lot of risk that young people feel. A lot of anxiety and a lot of sense of not having control. But the system almost builds a safety net under them that we just call routine, or we just call normal childhood, that for many of them, when it goes away, they got lost. So we know there were kids who were already struggling significantly in our systems and needed lots of high-touch services that were immediately sort of eviscerated in this closure world. And I think what we have now observed are lots of kids who felt really good with routine, who had to rediscover how to be successful. And that's been its own risk to them. And the wave changed from euphoria to a lot of parents saying, whoa, like, I don't know how to do this. And what are my supports? How can I help my own kid? We put a lot of guidance to the system at the time. It was guidance on content and learning. It was guidance on SEL. It was guidance on where to get resources and help to the extent possible. We were guiding districts to focus a lot on family check-in early on. We were not telling them, get immediately into math and science and English language arts and PE. We said, have an inventory of your families. What's their connectivity option? Can you ensure that you can make contact with a child, a student, a parent, a family? That relationship maintenance will be a precursor to introducing more content later. And again, some districts just really took off and others did not. That was really rough for a couple of weeks because there were so many different results. A neighboring district would really be doing well, and 5 miles away, somebody would say, why are they online? Why are they getting supports? Why is there a daily check-in in their community? And I really haven't heard much from my district. And so we find ourselves in an interesting moment where what we want for student achievement with respect to academic success, social emotional success, and behavior success suddenly became the classic function of state guidance, but 295 districts all sort of deploying in their own way with their own disparate opportunities of resources and professionals, professional development. And like so many things in our state where we love local control, the system itself started to say, whoa, this is really, really diverse from one place to another, and not in a good way, and began to ask us at the state office, can you put more shape around things here? Can you tell us a little bit how to narrow the world? Our response to that, honestly, was to find the places both in statute and in request by the system where we could land and add value. So we definitely tightened up our expectations around continuous learning. We said part of what helps kids be successful is routine. So districts, you need a framework that looks like a regular routine for kids. And it's not going to be every day for 5 or 6 hours a day, face-to-face online like it is in our traditional model, but it needs to be something students can count on and families can count on. And again, different deployment, different successes depending on where you were. We went on in some of that guidance to say, hey, this is definitely also about checking in with families around mental health and having a plan to identify where you think students are struggling and documenting that, either to bring resources as much as we can at a distance or to absolutely be prepared in a time where we can return. The other thing they wanted us to do was tighten up academic stuff. So we did tighten up a little bit the notion that we have learning standards, but we have literally hundreds of standards. So if you can imagine a matrix of kindergarten to 12th grade, and then across it all the subjects, and then in each subject and in each grade, there's a couple of learning standards. Suddenly you realize this state has 200-300 learning standards, and teachers have never been able to get to all of these. But our belief, and now I'm speaking personally and a bit from what I'm trying to lead my organization, is that we have inappropriately equated student achievement with kids being able to produce high volumes of workload, high volumes of worksheets, homework, lots of content, lots of quizzes, lots of tests. And that is an anxiety-ridden process when you take that exact same model and you just move it to online where kids don't have a regular check-in with their teachers. When they're at home with the frustration of a parent who can't lead them through math, right? Heck, I even struggle, and I've got a ton of calculus under my belt even through grad school, but I struggled to move my 10th grader through his advanced mathematics. So that risk that began to form in the family around trying to maintain this learning was something we observed early and said, districts, you got to simplify this. Get this down to some really core standards. Simplify the learning so that students understand it's about mastering the essential stuff they need to know to have success at the next level. Our goal was not to replicate what we had been doing face-to-face, but to say to the system, you need to give them confidence and hope right now that what they're doing is maintaining what they've learned or building some skills around a narrow set of expectations and give them the confidence that they're going to the next grade. And we have time to build supports around that. That helped, I think, a lot of families when they learned, like, we're not holding back kids in mass and we're not doing any of that. The last thing that they asked for was grading, and we never expected we'd have to offer guidance about this. And it's not without its challenges, of course, and you've all read about it. Some of you are experiencing it as parents. But the system said, hey, grading's been wide open and sort of Wild West for decades. We all get to do whatever we want. Can you tighten that up? Well, our response to that was, we're not going to pick a grading system for every district, given how different the experience is, but we're also not going to allow you to create more risk and more mental health struggles for kids who are desperately worried about failing classes because they can't connect, or it's not a safe environment at home to do their work, or they just can't do this right now. Or it candidly, in some cases, where systems fail to reach kids effectively. So we got rid of fails, and we said there'll be nothing in the no credit world. You need to offer a letter grade. Kids can't regress. They can't go from an A to a B or a B to a C. If they put in the work, they maintain a grade, or they can improve it only. Or teachers, if you don't think the student was able to connect or we didn't do a good job with them, you can give them an incomplete, which doesn't impact their GPAs in high school and all that, and then have a plan for returning for engagement and learning. I do think on balance that help families to sort of take a deep breath and understand, wow, this is serious stuff here. We're clearly not trying to go backwards at all. But then there's the fights between districts who picked an A through C schedule or an A only schedule, and we've kind of gotten through that. But I wanted you to sort of understand that from the deployment system here, the response back from families has been an interesting ride. Euphoria in the beginning, big worries about the permanent closure, but they thought they could really manage it. And then in the last couple of weeks, what's emerged is I'm done, right? Just lots of traffic about this has gotten better sort of in terms of process, and we're getting more contact and there's a more routine to it, which on balance is helpful, but parents are done. They're emotionally spent by the trauma of their own job loss or working from home. They're managing their work life in many cases, or their financial risk if they're not working, and they're trying to manage kids at home, trying to be their teacher, even as they have advanced through their education. And I would say to you today, if we talk to families, they would say on balance, I want you to open school this fall under any circumstances. Let's figure out the health, let's figure out the PPE, let's figure out the distancing, let's come up with models here, but I can't do this. So we are managing to the best of our ability some of that expectation, and I will talk a bit about kind of where we think we're going in terms of trying to open schools next year. But let me just briefly say that we have tried to check in with parents formally and informally through PTA and other organizations. We've had them communicating to us through a direct email link here in the office. We, of course, take feedback from the field across the state. And I want to just come back to this point I mentioned earlier. It's interesting that some students, and I meet with them now weekly or so, kind of depending. We have a large group of students we meet with really broad race, ethnicity, gender, geography. And then recently we've met with students who are in group homes or juvenile rehabilitation locations or foster youth, teen moms or pregnant moms. So we've had a group here that we met with that really tried to give us a deeper dive into an experience from those who have already experienced a significant amount of risk in their lives and quite a bit more trauma than most of their peers. And I'm going to be honest with you, they are across the board, students are on balance wanting normalcy. They want to come back to school, but there is always a thread of them who say that's not the safest place for me. I didn't feel like school was necessarily the place where I could thrive before. And there are some of them who make the argument that if they could be more isolated, maybe that's not the right word, but more empowered with the freedom of their own schedule and not the pressures, often the social pressures that come along with a system that still completely rewards extroversion and completely rewards kids who socialize well and like to be in large, dense groups and moving through routines of bell schedules and all of that. There is a thread of students who say that kind of isn't the best thing and wasn't for me before. And they certainly get that most of their colleagues want to do that. But I think as you all think through the impacts of this, and as we try to deploy systems of support for students, it's shining a light on the fact that we have to differentiate our supports. And a return to school model, probably many would argue, is certainly best for the economy. It allows parents to go back to work and all of that stuff. And most kids, I think, would thrive under the routine and the structure as I described earlier. But there are some very anxious about coming back, and it's underlying issues they had before we closed. And now you compound it with the fact that a lot of them say, is it safe? Is it healthy? What kind of risk do I have when I come back there? I often ask kids very directly, by the way, not just sort of the social aspects of coming back to school or the academic aspects, given how disruptive this was, but I say to them, are you afraid to come back for your health? I generally get three answers. One is by a lot, they say, no, I'm not personally worried about my health, although there are kids who are immune compromised who say definitely so. Most of them say, I'm worried that we will get it. We will be asymptomatic or even have some challenges, and then we'll bring it to family members who are vulnerable. So they definitely understand why we closed, right? We didn't close because the epidemiology pointed to high risk for our population of 5 to 18-year-olds. We closed and the globe closed to school because they tend to be carriers that put others at risk. But there's also a thread of them who say, I've read enough to know that even if I get this and I'm asymptomatic, it may have lingering impacts on my health long term. And interestingly, that's emerging more and more. You're reading about issues in New York and some other places, mostly birth to 5 risk for kids. But that kind of medical anxiety is new for our students. I think it's an added risk as we try to think about multi-tiered systems and we focus on what they're experiencing both now at home and what the return to school might look like. So the other aspect of our work, which isn't direct service by us, but in partnership, is candidly, we don't know the experience at home right now, given how much limitation there is by our partners at DSHS and Children, Youth, and Families. Our caseworkers who would do wellness checks and connections with families, particularly those who have faced trauma, substance abuse, neglect, and other issues, I think they've been significantly hampered, certainly in the beginning, because of the inability to do face-to-face stuff and the overall risk of, showing up at somebody's door to do a check and everything. So I think there's this stunning moment of lack of visibility right now that will emerge as we unlock the economy and the governor restores some things. I think our public services will re-engage families from sort of the human services side of this. And we will uncover some things that are probably very, very challenging. That has a ripple effect on schools because we always want to coordinate those services when we can. And that means we need plans as we come back. And we are guiding districts to having intentional plans about our potential return this fall that include significant evaluation and documentation of students who they did not connect with during the closure, who they had limited connection with, or who they thought were in very complicated environments before, making sure they re-engage their county officials and state officials and caseworkers and really be intentional about that, including as early as this summer, really engaging those families where we can get to phase 2 or phase 3 of the governor's order and begin to have up to 10 or up to 50. We can do a lot of services that are very specialized over the summer to give us a better opportunity with still a lot of unknowns. Okay, so what are the return models? We're just now forming a group to look at this. We're looking at 5 nations around the planet who have come back or attempted to. We're looking at multiple states who mostly have good plans, but very little experience in the return. There is a regulatory side of this that will dominate. So the health side of this will tell us about distancing and masks and thermal scans and hygiene practices, and they will give us a regulatory environment in which we can operate. And then we are building models for what that might look like. If you are suddenly limited by regulation to not have so many kids in a classroom, you can imagine the models we have to think through. Is it every other day for students? Is it every other week for students? Is it every 2 weeks you're on and 2 weeks you're off? Because that's how long, in case there's a infection in a particular cohort, they would then be home for 2 weeks. That is a nightmare for families in terms of childcare and trying to build a model around it. So very few people want to do that, and yet it's probably the best model for keeping cases from peaking, because every 2 weeks your students would return to isolation. You would have time for incubation for this to run its course, and you would return kids. Is it that we will focus our face-to-face time on kids who need it the most, those who experienced trauma prior and during, those who didn't have connectivity, those with an IEP and need special services? Do you put your energies there and ask students who have less need for those services to take the bigger brunt of more distance learning? There are those who make arguments that you focus on K-8, right? These are the kids who won't have as much success at home. They need to be guided more often with supports of our educators and our support staff. And they're the ones parents worry about not having quote unquote childcare for. So it sort of lines up best with the needs of the economy. You get a bunch of your certificated staff at the middle and high school level to be more focused on early grades and middle. And then you essentially have your high school students being more independent in their study. Others have responded and said just the opposite, right? Just the opposite. We saw one country internationally who said, no, we'll put resources at homes. We'll focus elementary school kids to stay at home because they're less likely to be able to adhere to 6-foot distancing rules, and they'll keep touching their faces. And so, you know, some countries have said, we're going to keep our elementary kids at home. It's our high school kids who are at this critical learning space, particularly in math, that has this sort of linear relationship often, and they've brought their high school kids back first. This is my very complicated way of saying to you, there are no rules for this. And people are experiencing it differently, and systems are responding to it differently. And we are doing our best to understand what's happening around the globe as well as in other states. At this point, you can expect by early June, we will deliver a set of recommendations to our districts that include pretty tight health guidelines. Those will be the shalls. You shall do this to open. A menu of opportunities for them on how to deploy teaching and learning and support services. That is mostly going to be an option of districts. If you're in OMAC, you've had a very different experience than in Seattle. If you're out on the coast, you've had a very different experience than you have in Vancouver or Spokane. So we will differentiate a lot more coming out of this thing. Totally guided by the health. The governor will reserve his authority, of course, to monitor the health metrics and close down regions or geographies or counties or even individual schools or districts if he feels like those frameworks are not in place and have not been adhered to. And then the last thing we have to deliver for districts is some confidence that they still have their budgets intact for next year. And I do feel good about that for next year. So that's 2021. I think the 21-22 year holds more risk for everybody in the state because the legislature will undoubtedly burn through our rainy day fund by then. And in the absence of the economy picking up fast enough or an enormous surge of resources from the feds and another relief package, I think we've all got some worry going forward. And those of you in the higher ed world, and particularly the UW world, you know the history of this. Higher ed always takes a much bigger impact here. Okay. The last thing I want to say to you is there is some federal money already flowing to districts. One of our guidance pieces for them is to focus on the gaps. It's sort of your mantra there at the Smart Center, as you saw in the introduction. We want districts to think about their emergency funds, and believe me, it's not a lot. It's the equivalent of a little over 1% of their budgets, which is coming their way here in the next 6 weeks or so. We want them to obviously reimburse for costs already experienced by COVID, but we definitely want them to be thinking about the students who were most impacted by the separation. What do they need to do this summer to really engage those families, to build supports, to support students with disabilities who lost services or minutes of service, compensatory services we call it. We want them to be thinking very intentionally about mental health screening and SEL work. What framework will districts put in place that's systemic as they bring students back to not only assess the gap in student learning on content, but what did students experience at home? How are they feeling about coming back, and what is their plan to build supports around that? This is an area we have all collectively been working on for several years now, made more serious by this moment. And we have to secure our state resources, use a little federal money, and defend like HE double hockey sticks here, our resources going forward, because what we cannot afford to do right now is go back to that place we were at in 2010 to 2012, where we believed we could sacrifice wraparound services, mental health supports, safety supports, the whole child approach. We sacrificed a ton of that in public ed to just focus on content in the classroom. It was about math and science and the tests around it. If we do that again, we will have absolutely failed our students and our families. The content will fill itself in. We now know a lot about how kids can catch up in academic content, and we have systems that support that better than ever. What we are going to be starved to do is effectively address the mental health needs of our kids. those who are excited to come back and experienced challenges at home, and those who kind of don't want to come back right now and would be looking for an approach a little different than just sort of shoving them back into classrooms of 30 and every 53 minutes rotating them through cycles in the case of middle and high school students. So there's a lot there for you. I think the Q&A will be illuminating. I will answer any and all things you have. Do not be shy of leaving our narrow topic here if you are a worried parent with a narrow topic. Do note, though, I don't comment on the local policies of local districts because I don't control them. Locally elected boards, they have their own budget and policy framework. They elect their superintendents, they elect their staff, they deploy within a state framework. But yeah, I will not be commenting on your particular love or frustration of a particular district, but I can be pretty candid about what we are seeing around the state. So with that, I know folks are watching the chat and the Q&A and are going to broker that, and I'll take a drink of water and let's get going.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Reykdal. I appreciate the recognition of mental health needs being in some ways even more sort of immediately critical than content, and the fact that no one size fits all. Some of this really resonated personally as a parent who sometimes feels done with some of those responsibilities as well. So thank you so much for that. I think at this point I'm going to turn it over to Larissa to moderate the Q&A. So thank you so much for that, and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Reykdal. And thank you to everyone who is attending, who sent in questions. There are some really great questions here in the chat. So there is a lot of people who are interested in understanding, especially since we have this state guide local implementation model, but how is OSPI working to avoid allowing COVID to exacerbate inequities in school? How is OSPI able to ensure equity of both mental health services and learning opportunities for students who need it the most?
Yeah, it's everything now. And it's been everything. And we've been moving there since I came into this office. We've been attempting to build services and resources that disproportionately, in a good way, focus on communities who need it the most. And so, wins and losses along the way. We finally got an infusion of elementary school counselors for the first time in decades last session. We've been working on this for 3 years. It fell by way of the veto as the governor was seeking to obviously balance the budget and not start up new things so that he could avoid deeper cuts later on. So that was to focus on Title I schools. So we were going to focus our counselors on schools with high poverty and as you know, a high correlation with student risk in those communities, generally speaking. So we deal with the resources we have, and we are definitely currently in a model when it comes to the academic side of our supports of trying to drive more resources to districts who need to purchase devices and connectivity for families so that we can create those connections and relationships at home. And so that's been building out over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And we will personally at OSPI be using some of our emergency money to purchase connectivity for students who are low income on free and reduced price lunch, or are state dependent in some other way. Maybe it's a housing voucher, maybe it's some other form of public assistance, where they live in an area where they can be connected but have not been able to afford it. We will purchase connectivity for them for the next year as we go through this. So we're trying to deploy differently and recognize who needs the support most, under a presumption that nothing smooth about returning is going to be the reality. It's likely that some can and some can't return. It's likely that if cases peak at all, that we'll have to close down schools. So we're trying to anticipate a kind of a hybrid model where maybe we are flipping a little bit. And in that case, we have to better connect families so that as we deploy services, not just academic, but mental health and supports and social services, that we can actually touch and reach families at a distance and make those connections. So that's some of the work we're doing. We're obviously getting our districts to focus the $200 million in federal money that are coming disproportionately on those who need it the most. We're challenging them to think about gaps and to think differentially about this. So that's our goal. We get to guide the system towards those expectations and monitoring. So we also want to know how that deployment's going and who's got gaps and who's connecting. But again, local state tension, we guide to this framework, and then districts have to deploy that. And they're doing that based on local board decision making. And I think for the most part, doing a good job with it, but it will not be smooth everywhere. And then the big challenge for us too is how to convince legislators that in a time like this, you don't actually cut budgets, especially for young people who are developing academically, mentally, emotionally, physically. This is the time you invest more. And I hope they learned a lot from the 2008, 2010, 2012 risks that occurred. It was quite a setback. So advocacy, deploy the resources we have now, and redeploy the resources we have now to be better targeted.
Great, thank you. I think there are some specific questions here about school counselors and support for students who are experiencing more, severe mental health concerns, including, high levels of suicide rates compared with maybe without having adequate numbers of supportive professionals such as, therapists and counselors. So considering, some of the funding concerns that are ongoing, what are the supports that, can be provided that OSPI can address in order to address the more severe mental health needs such as suicidality, with the concern of also ensuring that there's adequate school mental health professionals in our schools.
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge of our next several years for sure. We will advocate aggressively to bring additional resource in. It also means though that K-12 has to defend the role of State Department of Health and our county health officials and our county intervention supports, because we're doing more of that work in partnership with counties and with CBOs. So one of the things that gets a little sticky in my world is I'm a former legislator, and I have to tell people in education, you cannot sacrifice all that other stuff to protect just K-12, or you've not effectively served students. This has to be all of us. This has to be us saying we need mental health professionals in our community-based organizations, at our higher ed institutions, in our county governments. We are now using them more than ever before. Schools have figured out mostly that they're never going to hire enough people to do that. And those specialists often come in partnership to get scale. And so we have to do a better job defending the needs of those other organizations. And I bring that lens, but I sometimes get myself in trouble because people say, well, why are you willing to have us take more pain to protect this group over there? Well, because they're partners in our work mostly. So it also is about redeployment. So the reason I spent some energy and some time with you on why we're thinking differently about the academics is in time, you can shift some resources to student mental health supports, and you can focus on significant risks, including suicide risk, by simplifying your learning standards and not believing that kids necessarily have to be just regimented to 6 straight hours of academic rigor every day. If you can focus on what they really need to do to be successful and get core concepts down, you can take a little bit of a deep breath and put a little pause on the academic obsession that we've had for 20 years. And you can shift some of those resources to more whole child approaches, early interventions, mental health supports, helping students stabilize and do a lot more family engagement and family interaction. And that's the opportunity before us now. So that's why I spend time with mental health professionals on the academics, is to say, there's something we can do better over there that frees up resources and gives districts a better chance to make this shift. And we've got really progressive and amazing leaders in some of our districts who have been doing this long before it was a state framework that we tried to establish here. So there's some really good models out there that we can use that's very community-based and community-centric, where they lead with student mental health, and then they see that as a foundational strength to students being successful academically. Most districts haven't made that transition, some have, and that's the opportunity that we get now in our state guidance, is to help them flip by taking some pressure off on the same old regimen of pound content in them for 6 hours and test them. That is itself a trauma and a mental health risk, and it is diverting resources away from students who need a lot of support.
Great. I think a follow-up question we have here is about the alignment between school mental health and community mental health, and can OSPI advocate for more alignment between community mental health so that schools don't have the financial burden on them necessarily to buy mental health services, and insurance dollars can be used?
Yes, the answer is yes. And we had just redesigned the school prototypical model. This is how schools are funded, and I'm telling you this because our plan before COVID became a thing was to begin to start a very long dialogue with the legislature about all the next wave of investments, their next $500 million to $1 billion of investments exclusively in this space, with an explicit understanding that we would continue to serve students this way, invest in this, but not necessarily hire all those personnel ourselves, but instead use those dollars, protect those dollars, and be in better community partnerships. That was exactly our plan with our prototypical school rewrite. That's the thing I had poised just months ago, even to hand to the legislature for the next biennial budget request. I have to kind of rethink that a little bit, not to let go of the ambition, but in this reality, do they have $1 billion to spend on this? They do not. But we'll have to mine that for the best opportunity in the short term. But that was exactly where we were going with our next wave of resources.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions here about MTSS and multi-tiered frameworks. And now, in the chat, people are advocating and saying that these multi-tiered systems may be particularly important as we're thinking about the transition back to more in-person learning. So what is your opinion or OSPI's ability to kind of suggest or recommend to districts that they take time at the beginning of this transition back to focus on setting up a multi-tiered system of support, especially as we're thinking about the differential risks or challenges that certain students might be facing?
So what we get to do is build this guidance that we're going to drop on them in June that says, here's your health framework for reopen. Here are your models of deployment. And then, of course, here's some confidence we hope to build around their financial situation for the next year. Those are the three components. In that guidance, in that second piece, you will see us explicitly say to them, sort of through a checklist process, here's the recommendation of how you re-enter school that is not just about bus schedules and kids standing in lunch lines, but what is your approach to evaluating student mental health needs? How do you systematize that? What is your framework for addressing that? How will you redeploy resources? These aren't things we can tell them to do. I mean, to be honest with you, we would need a lot of statute change, and the legislature would have to carve out these things. But through our guidance, we get to say to them, this is the expectation we have for your reentry checklist. And as part of continuing to pay them apportionment, we always have the ability to go back and monitor that. We can go back and say, did you have adherence to your plan? How did you redeploy? It's not a heavy hammer, though. I got to be honest with you, in our state, it is not a heavy hammer because the statutes so clearly get to empower local school boards and superintendents to ultimately deploy their resources across categories. So we even give districts money for certain things that they are not required to spend it on that. They have to spend it all in a particular basket. But today, a school could grab all of their counselor money and do more librarians, or they could wipe out all their librarians and only do mental health supports with it. They get massive flexibility locally on this. Our job is to guide them to best practices and then monitor and collect data on how they performed. That's generally enough for really good practitioners to do the right thing within their local context. But it definitely is not a heavy hammer.
Thanks. I think also within that framework, more specifically, people are really interested in understanding more about guidance around special education supports for students who, it may have been particularly challenging to receive their, the education that they typically receive in person from home, as well as issues around testing, funding, and accessibility to special education supports.
Yeah, this has been probably the most challenging issue so far, just based on the volume of parent feedback and response and advocacy response. We have a positive civil right. It's established in federal law. Our state doubles down on that. Our state adds more money to support students with disabilities by a lot than the feds supply. And so with that context, you should know that, you know, it's a $3.5 billion biennium activity for us. So there is a lot of attention around it from a resource standpoint, a legislative standpoint, and of course, advocates, families, and parents. So our observation is that the stuff that can be done at a distance, for the most part, was delivered, but there were some huge voids in places for sure who got out slow or didn't deploy well. The big challenge was almost universally, there are some services that don't lend themselves well to a flat screen in 2 dimensions, you know, 20 miles away in remote sites. There are reasons we have built comprehensive supports in schools that include, you know, high touch services and therapies and mental health supports and nutritional services, right, and behavior supports. We have built a system, little cities, if you will, of transportation and food supports and nursing supports and everything to be in physical locations so that we can connect with kids better, they can learn from each other, and we can get eyes on kids in a way that's different than doing it at a distance. That was a struggle everywhere. So we've challenged districts to make sure they document. Where did you come up short of IEP expectations? Did you re-engage in IEPs to make a modification in plan delivery? Or if you didn't, did you accurately assess the services that were not provided? And then districts really have to build a plan as they re-engage this summer, as they transition into this fall, and certainly beyond. It's why we had them also as one of our 4 priorities focus on our seniors, because those kids don't get a second chance with us. They're going to graduate here and are already graduating. So we needed them to double down really heavily on seniors during this moment and be really intensive where they could one-to-one at a distance to get our seniors what they need. But for lots of our students, they've got a little time. And the concept here was to document and understand the moment that we were in. And then, you know, the first thing I think that comes back this summer when districts are all in phase 2 and they can have up to 10 are compensatory services for students with disabilities. Districts know what it is, they know the numbers, they know who our students are that need the support, and they need to get pretty active in re-engaging those families. Districts will tell us they're resource starved. They'll say, hey, you know, we deployed our teachers. They stayed busy through all of this, and so it's going to be hard over the summer. But that's why the CARES Act money is coming. That's why there's $200 million coming, is to help cushion the blow when they have to double down on services that normally they wouldn't do in the summer. So that's the concept.
Other people are bringing up some increased concerns about safety and schools being a important, a safe place for students who may not have safe home environments, and that we've seen, you know, reductions in reports of abuse, but that might be because schools don't have eyes on students, and the needs for, as we're transitioning back, for educators to, you know, have mental health first aid training, or to be able to provide that safe space again. And do you have recommendations for the role of schools as a safe space during this transition back, especially if there have been increased incidences of unsafe, you know, either activity or environments outside of the school building over this time?
Yeah, I think the first thing I observe is that everyone has a theory for how this has gotten better or worse, some aspect, and I do think we lack the data for obvious reasons, right? We've been isolated, and a lot of public employees charged with understanding what's happening in families and what's happening in terms of risk to students. They're not able to do that right now. Whether that's a mandatory reporter in a school district to observe something, or a caseworker in DSHS, or a community partner who's engaging a student or a family. So I think we should be careful about assuming what has happened. I think there's enough research about the risk, and there's definitely research about how schools have been historically a support for students. And so you can make good assumptions that when those supports went away, Some students were exposed to a lot more trauma and the potential for a lot more harm, but we don't actually have the data on that yet. And I think we're all going to have to make some parallel assumptions and some expectations of our districts that they're going to really double down on the students they knew going into this had more risk. They should be using that as a baseline as they assess student needs coming back. But then we're going to need a lot of people to help us with the data on this. Obviously, law enforcement and what we know about reported incidences all the way to suicide. We're going to have to know how this moment turned out for us to better be prepared for the next one. And you all play a huge role at that through some of the work happening in other parts of the University of Washington. And so, yeah, there's not a lot we know that's got actual empiricism behind it, but there's a pretty good grounding about who our students are. And it's why we focused for the first 3 or 4 weeks on knowing your students, getting connection, connecting with family. It wasn't about pumping out more math and science right away. And I know that's a busy part of the traffic I got on email because there's a lot of families who think that's all school is, and that's fine, that's important. But we knew that connections with families were everything. Districts know who connected and who didn't. There'll be no excuse, in my opinion, for them to not understand who needs high-touch services on the way back. But we don't exactly know the experience that kids had at home, and so we're going to get our districts to deploy with an expectation of support, but we're going to need a lot of partners to tell us how this thing went.
There are also some questions and comments about making sure that we're supporting our adults during the transition back. How much burden has also been on teachers and other, school educators and school staff who have also been balancing, a lot of the challenges that parents who are not educators have also been facing. Do you have suggestions for how to meet the needs of our adults in schools as well?
Well, it's to recognize that they face their own risk for sure. And some of them face their own serious emotional struggle. Time became an absolute torture for some, and you all experienced that. I don't care what anyone says about the ease of getting online and the great opportunity to do it 100 years after the 1918-19 pandemic. What was different about that is everyone ultimately isolated when it made this raging surge back in the fall, but they let it go. And we live in a time now where the trauma is there, the risk is there, the 24/7 pressure of understanding the risk, and then none of the work got let go. So many people were expected to go home given the technology and maintain a productivity even as they balance the needs of their own children. And so I wouldn't call them case studies. I didn't document this, but I got to have some very deep conversations with parents and educators through this to understand how they navigated this personally, how they navigated it as parents and simultaneously as professionals. And I appreciate this question because I think it's very real. And it's why I'll take some heat from some people, but we needed summer break this year. And people will say, well, we lost so much instructional time. Yeah, we lost 300 hours out of 13,320 hours over the course of a kid's lifetime. We lost a little over 2% of instructional time if a kid did no engagement. But the risk of trying to force that kind of content and that pressure in July and August to get us academically caught up to a planet that was all shut down, candidly, is an absolute risk to mental health, fatigue, and trauma. We cannot jump into September without giving everybody the ability to take a deep breath this summer, to make sure that they are healthy, to get off of screens and the pressure of learning and the pressure of connectivity, and giving them a chance to reflect and rethink a little bit. We do need supports, but you will not see me pushing for year-round school through this thing in a traditional sense of just piling on more days on the front end of this, for example. We need a break. Everyone needs a break from what we have experienced, and then we've got to redeploy effectively this September. And that means, traditional EAP programs and definitely understanding some of the adult workers who need to stay home. They're still in a high-risk category. It is so complex to build models around that. So who comes back, who stays in their home environment? But the question is so powerful because professionals experienced this as much as kids did. And I think in some ways, and again, I'm only reflecting as a parent now, in some ways, teenagers think they were designed for this moment. And some of them have really loved the freedom. I observe that as parents and as teacher parents, this was more load than they have ever experienced as professionals, collectively. And I think it's a huge burnout risk for us if suddenly there are advocacy groups pushing to get us immediately in July and August and go to year-round school and make up those days and hours. That would not be the best thing for the system.
You mentioned that in June, you're going to be, releasing these guidelines for schools, and we've been mostly talking about what the guidelines for schools are going to be academically, for mental health, safety, etc. But you also mentioned that there are going to be some health guidelines around, in these recommendations, and the health guidelines are probably going to be maybe more strict than what you can necessarily, not regulate, but ask of for maybe some of the academic or social emotional supports. So people do have questions about the health dynamics of returning to school. What are some recommendations that you might expect coming down the pike regarding masks, or regarding contingencies in case there is a resurgence of cases in the fall? And can you speak a little bit more to some of the health concerns and recommendations that schools might be expecting?
Sure. I can speak to what our dialogue is with those who have the authority over this. So we're in almost daily contact with the Department of Health. They have guided the governor through his decision making. They've relied heavily, of course, on virologists and the medical community, primarily out of the UW, who's guiding the planet, quite frankly, on this stuff right now, which is pretty amazing, even though I'm a Coug, go Cougs. So what we observe from them is some things that are obvious. There's actually a protocol that we can teach kids and adults about hygiene, should we have the opportunity to return face to face, that probably has the biggest impact. The mask is a less known quantity in the epidemiology. It is definitely the ability to minimize the risk of symptomatic patients. A sneeze or a cough contained is a very powerful thing. It doesn't actually protect you from other people who have symptomatic expression, because it's really about you being in contact with droplets and then touching your face or touching your mouth or touching mucous membranes. And so there's actually not a known, like, you shall wear masks is not actually in the science as like that works. But in the absence of knowing for sure, the default for a lot of jurisdictions, whether they're nations or states or, the city of Seattle, is you're going to wear a mask, because at least it minimizes somebody who doesn't know they have it or does know from spreading it. So I think you can expect strong recommendations around masks, maybe not mandates. And we could have an entire 2-hour webinar on why regulators don't like mandates, because it then creates a legal obligation to provide something. And then if it doesn't get provided, people get sued. And so I would guess that the health folks, the public health folks, are weighing enormous variables here. But I would guess thermal scans are going to be a must. The best thing you can do is isolate anyone who has an expectation of virus or viral load, even if it's influenza, right? Not just COVID. And so thermal scans seem to be a norm in every country that's returned. Masks have been inconsistent in their application. Hand washing protocols, though, and hygiene protocols are absolutely there. And then social distancing. These particles can be in aerosol form, but for the most part, they have a geometric shape to what happens when we sneeze or cough, and gravity works and these things hit the ground. And if you keep 6 to 10 feet distance, you absolutely empirically reduce the risk of droplets impacting other people. So yeah, we know a lot, and I guess the health departments will tell us exactly what they know as must. Then there'll be a series of things that are strong recommendations because they don't quite have the empiricism. And then there's things they will tell us definitely are not there, like ingesting things that the U.S. Department of Food and Drug Administration have not yet approved. I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. We are getting close to the end of our time here. This has been incredible, but I am gonna ask about 2 more questions before we wrap up here. So again, another thing that that you mentioned is coming forward in these recommendations is also about budgeting and financing, if I gathered that correctly. So one question is, how do we think that the budget shortfalls due to COVID kind of impact school investments in terms of the implementation of the education goals that are outlined by the legislature, and what recommendations do you have around that?
Well, we're already building a pretty strong legal case that they can't touch 96.5% of the funding they appropriate to us, because they told the state Supreme Court 2.5 years ago that those were all the things they have invested in as evidence of fully funding basic ed as the paramount duty, and subsequently getting the court to close the McCleary case and end jurisdiction on it. So we have this awesome body of legal foundation here that says you really can't touch basic ed because you told the court that's what you needed to do to meet the obligation, and that stuff by court order cannot be reduced unless there's a research case to be made. The court was explicit to say you can't cut it for purposes of balancing your budget when times get tough. There is 3.5% of our appropriation outside of that, of course. Levy equalization is one of them. So those of you who have come from rural communities or maybe still live there, our property poor communities get subsidies from the state because they can't create the same amount of money from their local levies. We will fight like heck to keep that as well, because while that is perceived as enrichment and not necessarily a mandate, I have already told the legislature and guided districts to one very simple truth. No matter what the court said, the legislature came up short in special ed. They did not provide a guarantee that every student's IEP can be fully funded with state resources. There are districts still relying on their levies and their levy equalization dollars to ensure that civil right. And so I will continue to work with the legislature to tell them, don't even think about touching the 3.5% either, because districts are relying on that to do something that, quite frankly, you didn't quite fully fill. So I feel pretty good about securing K-12 dollars, but there's an inflation factor, there's a compensation factor to this going forward, there are healthcare costs that continue to rise. They will make a case that they don't have to invest new money and grow the system, even though costs are growing, but I'm confident that they won't take us backwards in any meaningful way. So what is at risk? The 15 to 20% of local budgets that are still functions of local school levies. Again, these are supposed to be enrichment, but in many cases they're used for pretty essential things. And they tend to underwrite services that are very thin in the state formulas. Counselors, mental health, all the stuff that I was about ready to deliver as a transformation of the basic ed model is the stuff that districts have been paying for with their levies. That's how I know it's basic ed, is because every district says they need it, but they've been relying on local taxes. If they have double levy failures over the next couple of years around the state, that will be the biggest financial risk to our districts. So I have this job of simultaneously keeping the legislature's investments flowing and being a real champion of local districts to raise levies, and helping communities understand the importance of that. So it's a bit of a stay tuned, of course. Capital budgets will absolutely be at risk, and it's frustrating, and we can talk more about that maybe down the road. But if there's something they have to put on pause at this point, it would be capital budgets, because we do not want to impact the professionals that are helping our students be successful in school. And at this point, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Thank you. So I'm gonna end on a question that I think was really shaping a lot of our discussion here about this shift that you were advocated for, from this really high focus on academics without considering student mental health needs. So have you seen any innovative examples of how you've seen districts shift focus from academics to student mental health within the current crisis, within their current budgets? And have you seen any of these examples that have put a particular emphasis on equity for students of color, or for students in special education or with other high needs? So.
Yeah, well, I don't get my geographic reach that I used to in the closure, so I would normally be driving 2,000 to 3,000 miles a month in the fall and the spring to observe school practices, both academic, non-academic, and other things. So I'm a little dated here given the distance model. But I will observe coming into this that both the Bellingham School District and the Vancouver School District, just two of many, I think had built some of the best community-based supports to support students in terms of mental health and early interventions, particularly in early grades, with a very particular attention to those who needed it the most, and by demographics and by intention, they focused on communities of color, recent immigrant communities, right? So lots of those experiencing gaps due to their immigration status and language access barriers, and students with disabilities. So I think those are two districts that if you all were, wanting to talk to folks and really understand how they have approached this from a community-based standpoint, I would say Greg Baker in Bellingham and Steve Webb in Vancouver are two that have done a pretty exquisite job of this. Susan Enfield in Highline always does a good job because she has a vision for success in one of the most complicated communities in the state. Hundreds of languages spoken there, very, very challenging model to deploy. I'm not as familiar with how they've engaged community as I am in Bellingham and Vancouver, but those are some areas that I think have done pretty remarkable work. And I'd encourage you, if you want follow-up with a local example of how they've done it, and then maybe ask them how they've transitioned to this distance model, those are places I'd go to. And Kelsey knows some other rock stars out there, and I'd have you talk to her for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're out of time. I know we didn't get to all of the incredible questions that were in the Q&A, but I was hoping that we were able to synthesize across the various topics that came up. One question that has kept coming up is whether this talk and discussion will be available later, and we will be posting it to the Smart Center website. Megan, I think, will put the link again in the chat, and if you were on our attendee list, I think she will also email that out to you. So I just want to thank everyone so much for being here. And Aaron, do you have any final words before we wrap up here?
Just wanted to thank Superintendent Reykdal once again for coming and joining us. It was, I think, a really great discussion, and we appreciate these sort of insights into the current thinking related to how we can respond to this crisis and support our state's students and ensure that they have the most positive mental health we can possibly facilitate. So thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. And I think that we have an opportunity after this for some internal discussion at the Smart Center as well. So I think we have a separate link for that, Superintendent Reykdal, and we'll look forward to that as well. But thank you everyone for coming. Again, next academic year, we will be continuing our Smart Center speaker series. And we will, of course, be in touch and post information on our website related to whether or not that will be in person or remote. Thank you very much.